The reason I have you on, in addition to being a great, insightful person, right, is just the fact that your experience of having long-term relationships in a home with people who are refugees. There's something unique about that because not everyone has that experience, right? To living together, right? And this seems quite like a radical view for others, but in a way, sometimes it necessitates that level of engagement and high touch in order for that to be realized. And so, what do long-term, reciprocal relationships look like with those in your community? Does the power dynamic there, that's, someone coming and you being the person who's hosting and suddenly they're a part of the family in that house, does the power dynamic ever go away? And should it go away? Should there always be like, okay, let's be honest here. Yeah, I am a worker here and you are not. Let's not pretend it's not there. Or is there a sense of like, no, we really are just brothers and sisters at the core? Secondarily, functionally, I am a worker who will aid you and be a companion or whatnot. How does that actually look in real life?
Yeah, there's a couple of different questions sort of embedded in that. I mean, one of the
Go.
things that I think is important to say about Romero House, and I alluded to before, is we are a very transitional community.
Hmm.
And so the workers who come to Romero House stay for 1 or 2 years, and the families who live at Romero House usually stay for about a year. And then when we think of our community, we also think of our neighbors. Like, we're pretty planted in our neighborhood. And so those people, and also various volunteers, whether they're board members or receptionists or interpreters or gardeners, whoever. And those people also have a degree of transition, although it's not
Mhm.
as frequent as the residents or the workers.
Hmm.
And so long-term relationships are really interesting to think about, because sometimes those long-term relationships are still tied to Romero House. Like, it might be, we have some of our board members are former residents
Hmm.
who now are in positions of leadership. I think now we have 2 board members who are former residents. Or we have 2 of our staff are former residents who've lived at Romero House. And so they've had a long-term relationship. Or I'm still the director of Romero House. And if I stay in touch with families, and I stayed in touch with many, I'm still in my role as a director of Romero House. Whereas we have many workers who were companions or neighbors, like lived in the same house with families, and those families leave and those workers leave.
Hmm.
And I would say that's the situation in which I've most seen the power dynamics diminish in the long run, because those are people who are like, sometimes it's a family has lived with a worker and then they move out of Romero House, they finish their worker program, and that family and worker, like, they just really got along super well, and they continue a relationship for
Hmm.
many, many years.
Hmm.
That it consists of just like going over for dinner and going to weddings and sometimes going on vacations together, and really just evolve into friendships.
Yeah.
Not in all cases, like, there's some cases where there's still like a level of, I'm coming to you to ask you for help with something. But I would say in many cases, those relationships evolve.
Hmm.
And that's been a really interesting place of being able to see how power relationships can change. But I think it's because they become removed from their context at Romero House.
Yes.
They're like
Yeah.
institutionally outside.
That's right. So it's like as if a front load of like heavy, high engagement period, followed by, okay, let it go, and outside of that, it's like in a way you're not institutionalizing long-term relationships or like planning it. That's just like how normal relationships happen. You connect with someone, you don't connect with someone,
Mhm,
then you keep in touch or you don't keep in touch, right? It's kind of like,
mhm,
but having that high touch time where you're actually like living together and being in community creates the possibility for those things, especially when you're coming from such different places and different contexts or different values or different understandings of things. It seems like that goes a long way in providing that. But what I'm hearing from you is the long-term relationships happen most with people who are not necessarily attached organizationally to Romero House long term?
Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah.
would say people who know, like, it's no longer an institutional role that they hold in some way at Romero House. Because I think we try as an organization to diminish power, but it would be naive to say that you can exist without the reality of power dynamics and
Hmm.
relationships, because there
Hmm.
is, me as director, the workers in their roles, like, we have an accountability
Hmm.
that the families living at Romero House simply don't have. Like, I'm accountable to our funders, I'm accountable to our board. I mean, today, what do we have? We have a resident who was out of the province briefly. And so coming back to Romero House, we're requiring him to quarantine for 2 weeks before interacting with other people in the house. And so, I mean, that is a role that I, as, a person in authority, like, I am accountable to our community to make sure that we're following our COVID protocols in this time of crisis. And so, like, there's that, especially in COVID, I feel like my authority or my level of power has, like, risen to an uncomfortable place out of
Yeah.
necessity.
Hmm.
And to deny that would be totally naive.
That's what the idea of the more acute the situation becomes, um, the more risk involved in a way, the more engagement of some kind of bureaucratic or whatnot needs to kind of come into play a little bit, which is perhaps why in my setting at the Evergreen Center, where there was a lot of fights and a lot of things breaking out, um, why we kind of needed more of that than others. But I think to say that that's important, and also just to note that if you put the same amount of layers of bureaucracy and policies and procedures in one organization, because it mitigates risk at a high level in one place, and apply it as a blanket statement to all others, where it isn't as high. That's when I think, you look at things, you're like, well, they have that why don't we have it here? It's like, well, we don't have it here because it just doesn't, we don't need it.
Mhm.
Let's bring it up when it's necessary, rather than just bringing it everything that is possible, like, um but I have a quote, like, I don't know if I think I'm studying this guy Ivan Illich for my PhD, right? And you heard me talk about him. There's this line he says here. He uses the word vernacular, and the word vernacular is like kind of like home language, where it's not like the academic language, for example, but it's just a home culture language. And he says, and it helps to encapsulate like subjective neighborly contributions that are, and I quote, he says, motivated by thoughts of exchange and actions which are, by their own nature, escape bureaucratic control. Um, which I find that the way he said that was really crucial. It's like, and it describes the scenario that you have of someone working in Romero House and a family being in Romero House, and then suddenly they're out in their own home, and the person who's the intern or the student, the worker, is no longer there. Suddenly, there is no mechanism of bureaucratic control. There is no accountability necessarily. It's like it's in that zone in which this neighborly engagement in its purest form, in a way, can function, right? And we have these not, maybe they are sufficient, but insufficient kind of housing frameworks that we do have, because it doesn't always work out that way where we can do that, but where we function within that, in a way, that bureaucracy for a season in order to establish that. But I thought that was a helpful way to think about it. I'm not sure if you have more thoughts about that, but um,
Yeah, I think so. And I think because we try and live differently, like, have a different model while we're at Romero House, even though I say it's not possible to really get rid of those power dynamics, I
mhm,
think it sort of sets the stage to make
yes.
that possible in future relationships. So by
Mhm.
having, the workers living in the same house, so you have, like, a worker on the third floor and the second floor is a family living there, and they share that space a lot more. The family, like last year in the house I was living in, we had a family from Iran, and Iranian food is unbelievable. And, like, this woman loved to cook and, like, loved to share food with people. And so, like, sitting in her living room was it was just such a comfortable thing that we did. And so you're already breaking barriers. And, you know, I'm sitting downstairs working, and like she's asserting her authority by knocking on my door and saying, like, Jen, come up and eat lunch. And it's like, so you were already sort of setting the stage for a different kind of relationship, I think, and trying to like live outside of that bureaucracy as much as we can in the context of Romero House, that it makes that transition, once that bureaucracy is gone, for people who have left the community in a physical sense, I think it makes it a lot easier to have those kinds of relationships.
That's a huge nuance there, because some would say, well, this is just how we do it here in this social sector. We just do it this way here. And if there's another world where you get outside and you bump into the person and it happens, then great. But the transition between those two worlds seems so vastly impossible to bridge, that they, in a way, if organizations can know how to, you know, they might start quite bureaucratic at some point, but slowly transition, have some transitionary program or whatnot that allows for the potential of long-term relationships, that can create the longevity of those relationships, right? And those possibilities, which is, that is a great point. And now I know why you've been here for so long. You just want to eat good food.
It's exactly why I've been here for so long.
That's the motivation.
But I think it's like, I think as you say, that sort of in between space, like I think that's where Romero House tries to exist.
Okay,
and we don't always, like sometimes we lean towards either direction, I guess. but that's where we try and exist. And sometimes it's easier to do that in our homes than it is to do that in our center. But we try and do it there too. And I think you've experienced this, Jesse, when you've been at our center, but it's obviously not happening in COVID right now. But we have a walk-in program. So that's for people who don't live with us, but might be in shelters or in their own housing. And they come in, they walk in. Now they phone in, but normally they walk in and receive support in, I don't know, navigating the refugee process or applying for legal aid or whatever. And our ritual as a community is who's ever in the center, we stop for lunch for an hour from 12 until 1. Someone makes lunch and they make enough food that who's ever there, so like all the staff, all the workers, our volunteers, whatever walk-ins are there. Jesse's been there before, I think, meeting with Mary Jo. And we invite people to come to the table and eat together. And I think that is something that like takes a lot of people aback when they're sort of like sitting on the couch at the front of the center waiting, and they are invited to come and like sit down and eat a meal with all of these strangers in a place where they thought they were a client and like coming to receive a service. And like at their law office, they like the lawyer's office, they weren't invited to eat lunch. At your Ontario Works office, you're not invited to eat lunch.
That's
like,
right.
So to be invited by all of these strangers and we sit down and like the conversations we have over lunch are absurd. Like, I mean, if we were doing this now, we would be chatting about all the ridiculous Bernie Sanders memes that everyone would be like. That's to give you a sense of what that space is like. And so to be invited into that space that really is a space of community, I think that frames Romero House for the walk-in community as a space that is set apart and different from their other experiences with service providers or as a client. And so although our office isn't sort of fully in that middle transition space the way in our homes are, there's like little things that you can do to try and like bring that spirit into a space like that. So maybe that's something for churches to think about, like what it looks like. It's not a home space. It's not apart from the institution, but what does it look like to create a space like that that's conducive to like real encounters between people where they can trust each other and just like invite each other into each other's lives in a deeper way than just like grab a coffee after a service.
That's right. Oh man, that's a great point to land on and end on. I thank you so much, Jen.